All right, here we are. So today we're going to talk about the G word, right? This is the thing that people are afraid to say, I feel like these days, about how we govern our platforms and ultimately our APIs. So I guess first of all, who am I? Why should you listen to me? I'm Jason Harmon. I'm the CTO at Stoplight.io. Stoplight's a collaborative API design platform. We purely focus on just sort of design, but when you walk that back, there's a lot of other factors involved in designing an entire platform, not just a single API. So governance stuff is near and dear to us. Right, I can drive. So the other, I think, kind of big interesting factor in what we've compiled for you today is what we've learned from 2 years and over 50 episodes of the API Intersection podcast. We talk to folks who sort of lead API programs and that sort of thing to see, what works for them, what are their problems, that sort of thing. In addition to being a practitioner myself at, companies ranging from small startups to large public companies. So seen a lot of messes, and we have helped clean them up. So looking back in that past, I'm got enough gray hair to remember kind of the SOA days, and I've for some reason been reflecting on this lately on how did we govern back then versus how should we be now. So I think a little story here. When I was working for a large public company that had acquired a startup I was working at, about 3 years in, they said, you got to follow our process now, right? You can't operate as independently as you were. And my job was to develop some SOAP services to integrate a variety of large companies in, it was actually kind of Wi-Fi venues. And found myself having to learn what all these WS extensions were and all this stuff to make my SOAP service kind of match spec. And I'll give them credit. They had really good tools to kind of lint and validate my WSDL or whatever. But what I found was that there was a power structure in place. So I had to go through, and for those of you who've been at this large company, you'll know who I'm talking about. But I had to go to the big dog program management team to make sure that they were advocating for me to get on the schedule for the governance committee who would decide whether or not my API was good enough. And I think in some ways, when I look back, it's reflective of the culture of this at the time, which really came out of the fact that SOAP was a top-down big company thing, right? It was originally developed by Microsoft, then IBM came in, a couple of other large players, but ultimately a few of the large players told the industry how it would work in terms of integrating. I think when we look back, it wasn't exactly that successful. So in that era, it was about centralized control, kind of really projecting power from large, slow-moving organizations. Industry consortiums kind of ruled the day. And very much top-down approach, right? In terms of what you typically saw in kind of normal organizations trying to do their service-oriented architecture. I think what's changed in the modern context more than anything is treating things with an open source mindset. So, number one, kind of REST, and I know there's a lot of other things out there, but I think there's a lot of commonality here. REST, number one, architectural pattern, not a standard. So it's like, cool, here's something that really is innately grassroots. It's bottoms up in its definition of what it's meant to be. And in this kind of open source mindset, it's like you have a few committers, some maintainers, and then a community around it, right? Who are providing that input, feedback, contribution. So we'll kind of unpack this in what it looks like in reality, but I think this is important to keep in your mind that it's really about thinking about things in an open source way and not so much in sort of the typical enterprise command and control mentality. So I think part of this is, again, recognizing that it's okay to say governance if we recognize that it just looks really different and we're doing different things than we used to. So I want to make the word okay today, right? The most important aspect of this is really about decentralizing. And, I'm not like I'm not into crypto and all this kind of, I'm not like super zealot about decentralizing, but I think in terms of how you govern your platform, it's important that you're building a community around what you're doing. And I know usually we use community in the context of some external outreach, but I would say that you've got to master the internal community of your developers before you're going to have any success outside your company. And this is really about, what I call building your band of rebels. Find the passionate and informed people about kind of the API initiative and work to build trust and give them authority over time, right? Also recognizing that inside that internal community, and all of this could include external, but I'm going to focus on internal, get that right first, is recognize that you're not building one API. You're building into an ecosystem. And how this fits within that ecosystem is really important. And while I'm saying in the third box here, have a core team of folks who have the authority to break all the silos across the organization, that's great. There's no way that small team can know everything. So having sort of these outreach connections, these community tendrils into the organization, into all the right folks, and ignore the org chart, right? Find the folks who get it and give them authority is great. And with that all in mind, that means that you're operating on sort of building influence, right? And this is reflective of how I think engineering and product development tends to work these days, is top-down doesn't work. Building kind of, evangelizing the approach, building advocates, all through sort of influence, essentially, present a great option and people will find it appealing. I think this is the high level of what we see that works. And I think there's kind of a fifth leg here that is really it's one of the big culture pieces. And I said we're going to keep open source in mind. But if you're looking inside of the company, it's really thinking in inner source. And in very simple terms, if your developers can't look at each other's code because of the way that your silos are built in your organization, you are absolutely holding yourself back, and your platform transformation is going to be extremely hindered. Now, this doesn't mean that everybody writes against each other's code, but it means that they can contribute to each other. So when, let's say, two teams start to design an API and they realize, hey, we're building roughly the same thing, why don't we join forces for a bit, cross those lines, and we both succeed faster? That shared leverage is key, and if you don't have the structure set up to be able to share code, you are absolutely going to miss out on the opportunity. Furthermore, reviews is another facet here, is getting peer review from neighboring domains, from stakeholders within the company is essential. And if, let's say, your specs for your API are hidden behind some firewalled off source control, you're going to struggle to get the right engagement. So inner source mindset, right? And all of this is really about, again, a cultural facet is how can we think in the big picture platform terms? How can we think about the ecosystem that we're fostering around it? These are some of the enabling factors to get that going. So reflecting on all of that, these are to some extent really about, companies trying to do platform transformation, trying to kind of make these big shifts, but what does this look like in practice? How do we kind of break it down a little bit? I think the first and biggest one, and we hear, a lot about people saying, we're API first. And it's like, well, what does that mean? Right? It's a catch-all term a little bit. It's kind of like when, Fowler said microservices and everyone made up what it meant, right? I think we're in that same realm of, we see API product managers becoming a thing and trying to figure out what it means. And I think from my money, in saying your API first as a company, treating your APIs as products is step one, and it's a never-ending game of getting better at it. So we watch titles a lot on who's engaging with the Stoplight platform, and we've definitely seen over the last couple of years an increase in the frequency of API product managers engaging. And I know personally, 10 years ago when I was saying I'm a product manager, but all I do is an API, it was weird and there were very few people who did it. So one, it's heartwarming to see that the industry's finally recognizing the need. We're seeing these roles emerge. But again, I think we're still in the early days. So it really is kind of an ever-changing role in the sense that you're bouncing between architecture and, business concerns. There's a really broad scope. There's just not a traditional UI in most cases. So it's a different kind of customer with developers. But I think what this means for governance is that you need to have a broader sense of inclusion. If the only reviews and engagement happening around your API designs is in GitHub, you are not including everyone. You've got to find a way to get the product managers and their stakeholders engaged in this in order for your program to really recognize that APIs are business critical assets, and to really lean into building equitable partnerships around these APIs that are actually going to work for the business and actually grow things. That's not going to happen if you just toss it over the wall to engineering, right? So you've got to have this inclusive approach. A couple of high points, and I won't spend much time on this because I did a talk on it last year. You can pretty easily find on APIs as a product. But one is, build your APIs with the relationship in mind of who's going to be using it. This can really help scope down the things that you need to build, especially around auth. Business buy-in, again, how is this going to help the business grow? API initiatives, especially kind of in the umbrella of platform transformation, fail at a tremendous rate. And I think this is one of the main reasons why. And the third one is just for product managers to recognize that your acceptance criteria can be, heavily automated compared to any other kind of product that you would manage. So these are sort of just product manager, for the product managers in the crowd who are thinking, leaning into APIs. I think these are just key things that are a little bit different. And the reason to do all of this is, again, don't let your APIs be an engineered experience. You would never dream of building a user experience by tossing it over the wall to engineering. It's a multidisciplinary effort to do these things well. And, the product manager is the quarterback for this effort. So you've got to recognize that, let's lift this out of the engineering muck and turn it into a product, make it customer-centric, not system-centric. And I think this is the other biggest stumbling block. So I recap all this product stuff just to say that these are all considerations in how you govern things. How does this API you're building fit into the big picture? How is it going to grow the business? All these sorts of things. I keep mentioning reviews, and if you don't have some kind of process to review your API designs, you should probably think about it, right? Having one team build something in a vacuum is not going to produce as good of results as if you are engaging in some review process. So again, rolling back the history clock, we look back at that SOAP era, and you kind of typically had, your heavy hitter engineers in a committee or a group with, to some extent, unchecked power, right? You had engineers who decided what was good and bad. I think the difference now, and this is why I started with this kind of product perspective, is you've got to look at a lot more than the engineering facets to this. How is this going to work as a product? You've got to be intentional with its design to be appealing to the customers who are going to use it. And even if the developers who are using it aren't directly customers, there should be customer-centric ideas in there that are easy to recognize. You shouldn't have to read a manual just to make a simple call, right? So all of this, when we think about it, how to turn this API initiative, this development effort into a real product that is has a great developer experience, doing that through an inclusive, distributed authority kind of model, this is governance, right? Just doing a review process is governing, and that's okay to say. So recap here, again, more inclusive. I think also think about the folks who are maintaining this API in that open source mindset, that they are the maintainers, they're the committers, and that there's a community of contributors around them who are, as well as the non-technical stakeholders who are engaging with this project, right? I think with that mindset, you can cross those traditional company silo boundaries and really kind of look into a new future that you're all seeing together. So wrapping all this up a little bit into something that's maybe a little bit easier to think about as, things you can take back to your organization and kind of go, hey, how are we doing on these things? I think the first and most important is, top-down kind of power structures, and especially, I hate to say it, but engineering-centric power structures can be really corrosive to the organization. If you're thinking about, this kind of open source, inner source mindset about how you look at your company today, you kind of ignore the org chart a little bit and build a community around what's happening and find the folks who really get it and give them authority. You can distribute that power, and now you have something that is engaging the whole organization. I think the second bit is, while you can distribute a lot of power, ultimately somebody's got to be the librarian, right? Everybody wants to go check out a book, but nobody wants to do the paperwork. Somebody has to do that grind of a job, and I've done that job in a few different companies, and it's it's a little unrewarding. I'm not going to lie. It's hard work to build those relationships. It's hard work to decide what should and shouldn't be in your standards, that sort of thing. But somebody's got to do that job. And I'll say, for those saying, oh, great, here comes the big investment, if you're a business stakeholder here, we see companies with, 20, 30,000 people that might have a team of less than 5 doing this. If you've distributed that power efficiently, you've got a lot of contribution coming in, and you really just need someone to sort of sift through all that contribution and figure out what should be true for the whole company. And it shouldn't be a lot of things, right? This should be pretty narrowly scoped. And you should have some of that authority, again, going out to those individual sort of domain owners to make rules in their own domain that aren't particularly appropriate for the whole company. Again, in this sort of API first, platform transformation, whatever you want to call it, treat your APIs as a product. And those folks have to be involved in the process from the beginning of what this API is going to look like. It can't be an engineered experience. And I mentioned this too, that we talk about product managers a lot, but they're often the folks that are bringing in designers to look at how is this going to manifest in the portal, tech writers to think about how is it going to get documented. So product managers bring a whole host of capability with them beyond just prioritizing and this sort of thing. So important to think about how they fit into your governance model. And then finally, I think it wasn't exactly called out anywhere in here, but I touched on the notion of education, evangelization of what you're doing. To some extent, this is really about transparency. So like in my experience, what worked really well is you can give people a pile of standards, and I think of what I had to comply with in that SOAP era, that someone said, here's the 16 different WS- specs that you need to comply with. I had to spend a lot of time reading and learning what those things meant before I was comfortable including them in my project. I think done well, if you're asking folks to engage with tooling that helps do things like, for instance, linting with Spectral against an open API spec, something that helps automate this process and make it lower friction. Well, that's great, but if it tells me I did something wrong in my design, I should have some lead in as to why. And this is to say, telling people why you should do something is actually way harder than telling them what happens if they don't. So if you go through, here's our rules and what we think maintains great consistency and a good experience. And if we didn't do these things, here's what would happen. Here's the problems that we're solving. I think this is a really engaging way to bring developers into the process and feel like you're not in their way, you're saving them from future trouble. So transparency in this sense is transparency as to why these rules exist. So I already mentioned kind of Spectral a little bit there, but really the concept of a style guide or style guidelines of some sort. Take all the boring stuff that you would do in a review in looking at, hey, we do dashes in the paths and we do underscores in the query strings or whatever it is that you made up or stole. Automate that. Don't make some poor person dig through that stuff and try not to miss anything. It's almost impossible. So I mentioned Spectral just because we talk to a lot of people that use it. It's an open source project of ours, but there's certainly other options out there. Collaboration tools I already mentioned. If you're just doing GitHub PRs and conversations there, you're missing out. So look at how are you going to engage a broader audience than just the developers, just engineering. The other is this idea of kind of sharing components, things like a library of models. So a good example would be if you're designing APIs that multiple APIs reference a contact, like contact information, you should have one model for doing that so that, for instance, your address verification system only sees one model from many different APIs when it's called down to, right? And for the developer experience factor, if you're using multiple APIs that reference the same kind of information, it's always in the same shape, you just dried up my client code a lot in making that easier to deal with. And the final bit here, and I'm just going to beat it up again, is if you're not thinking about product managers who can manage APIs, get started, right? It's definitely that time. And I say solid here, but just to be real, like there is a talent gap here. There's a hole of people. There's a very small group of people who have a large depth of experience. So to some extent, it's finding who kind of gets it and maybe has a good network around them to learn. I think there's a lot of folks in this category, but make the commitment, start building that capacity. So my only plug-in here is if you want to learn more about this kind of stuff in the API space, definitely check out my podcast. We're published on all the platforms and stuff. It's called API Intersection. Again, we just bring on folks who do this sort of thing for a living and get kind of the inside scoop on what works for them. And in many cases, what doesn't, which is almost more valuable. And with that, I thank you all. And in the live version, I guess we'll have questions.